Genesis chapter number 22. Genesis chapter number 22. Genesis chapter number 22, and probably familiar passage to us. A lot of us probably read this. We probably heard this as a kid, and think about the story of Abraham, and talk a lot of times about how God promised him a son, and there's a long period of time that Abraham had to wait on that son. And when that son came along, God asked something of Abraham that seemed hard to imagine, I guess, to me. A man that had left everything to follow God and believe God, and God had finally sent him a promised child, a son. And then there comes this day and this time in Isaac's youth that God asked Abraham to take him up on a mountain and offer him up a sacrifice. And just seems like a hard thing to imagine, but we'll read a few verses of this tonight, and just something that God's put on our heart. There in chapter 22, we'll just start with verse number 1. It came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham. Now let me just say something real quick about God tempt Abraham. God does not tempt man with evil. God is not evil, He is light. And He is not tempted with evil, neither does He tempt man with evil. So when we talk about God tempted Abraham, this wasn't like God set Abraham up for sin. It was a trial, it was a test. And it wasn't a test or a trial to see if he'd do wrong, it's to see if he'd do right. Just want to clarify that in case you run into any skeptics or anybody that wants to start controversy with you tonight. For that God did tempt Abraham and said unto him, Abraham, and he said, Behold, here am I. And he said, Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains, which I will tell thee of. And Abraham rose up early in the morning, and saddled his ass, took two of his young men with him, Isaac his son, and clave the wood for the burnt offering, and rose up and went unto the place of which God had told him. Then on the third day Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place afar off. And Abraham said unto his young men, Abide ye here with the ass, and I and the land will go yonder and worship and come again to you. Now, like we said, this boy that Abraham had, his son, was his only son with Sarah. And this son was to be an heir of everything that Abraham had and everything that God had promised Abraham. And so Abraham, being an old man by this time, up in his 90s, and God sent him this son. Now all of a sudden He's asking him to take this son to the top of one of these mountains and offer him a burnt sacrifice, an offering unto the Lord. What amazes me kind of the most about this story a little bit, one of the things that amazes me the most about this story is Abraham's perspective of this place. Now when I read this story, and especially after having a child of our own, thinking about where Abraham was at, and he's a human being. He had feelings and thoughts and emotions just like we do. My thoughts of this would be a dreadful place. When I'd reached this place and I told the servants to stay here with the donkey, my thoughts would be, my boy and I, the lad and I, are going to a dreadful place. We're going to sacrifice. We're going to a fearful place, a dreadful place. But Abraham looked at this place where God was going to ask him to lay down his only son for a sacrifice, and said, Stay here. We go to worship. That's some perspective, isn't it? Some idea. I could only imagine seeing that tonight. And I thought a little bit about Abraham's perspective of worship and what is worship and what is the worship that God is looking for tonight in you and I. When we look at this passage of Scripture, God didn't need Isaac. What would He do with Isaac? Why would He need Isaac? But God wanted Abraham. He didn't want Isaac. He wanted Abraham's heart and Abraham's affection. Think about with worship, and I know we set aside a day of the week and we have a house set aside, but we're worshiping every day of our life. We're worshiping something or somebody. It's whatever gets our affection and gets our loyalty and gets our devotion, that's what we worship. Jesus would go on in the New Testament to talk to us about worship. And He said worship is no longer about being in a certain mount or a certain place, going through a certain ritual with external activity. But the Father seeketh worshipers tonight. And He seeketh such to worship Him in spirit and in truth. Jesus said of the Pharisees, they had a form of worship. They had a day, a place, and a ritual, and all these things they were to perform. And they went through a lot of ceremony and sacraments and all that. But He said this about them: outwardly, with their lips they do it, but their heart is far from Me. In vain they do worship Me. Worship comes from in here. It comes from in there. When Jesus spoke of worship, and the Father seeking such to worship Him in spirit and in truth, God is looking for people who have grasped Him. Inwardly have a grasp on Him. And in order to worship Him, you got to worship Him for who He is. Not what we want Him to be or think Him to be. When I think about Abraham saying we're going yonder to worship Yahweh, we're going there to worship God. Abraham wasn't worshiping God on his terms or what he believed Him to be or thought Him to be or wanted Him to be. He was worshiping Him for who He is tonight, the one and only true God who is deserving of everything. Everything we have, everything we got is the Lord's tonight. And Abraham pledged that to God. That if this is what God wants of me, and this is what God asks of me, and God desires of me, He is worthy. When you take the word worship and look at it in its form, break it apart, you'll find that word that represents worthship. It's talking about the value of someone or something, the worthship. How worthy is someone or something? And Abraham saying, I go to this mountain to offer up my only son and worship God, was saying, God is worthy. Just like He is, just as He is, He is worthy of it all. All that I have tonight. And Abraham was going there to lay it all down. That's the thing, in order to worship God. And not just go through Sunday morning worship. I'm talking about living a life of worship day after day. It's not I give God certain things or certain times or certain areas of my life, but God gets it all. God gets it. Why? He is worthy. He is deserving. Just as He is. Just as He is right now, just as He is tomorrow, He is worthy of it all. And Abraham saw this place. A place that when I read this story, all I see is fear and dread and worry and sacrifice. But Abraham said, I go to give it all to God, for He is worthy. Now you got to think the Bible's written in such a way for you and I to understand. God's an infinite God. He's a sovereign God. He's a provident God. He sees and knows. Nothing surprises Him or catches Him off guard tonight. So, but at the end of the day, you and I can't wrap our head around sovereignty. We can't wrap our head around what it is to be infinite. And so the Bible's laid out to us, and God has dealt with us, humanity, in a way that we can accept and understand and see. When Abraham got to this place, he didn't know the outcome. You and I have a great benefit tonight of looking back. Abraham was doing this in real time. He didn't know anything about a ram in a thicket. He didn't know anything about any of that. We've read this enough to where we just kind of skip through it and know the ending. Abraham was doing it in real time. Not seeing the future, not knowing the story was ending, and yet still willing to go and proclaim God is worthy. And there he goes up this mount, thinking, I'm going to take this boy, I'm going to offer him up. Here's something I thought about, could have went through his mind. How am I going to explain this to other people? How am I going to explain this to Sarah? How am I going to explain this to these servants? What I've done with my son. They'll think I'm crazy. And let me say tonight, for us to wholly, fully give God all we got and all we have and worship Him, just take Him as He is, not everybody's going to get it. Not everybody's going to understand it. Not everybody's going to support it. Not everybody's going to want to join in and get in there with us. But at the end of the day, whether what other people think or how other people feel, I believe sometimes, and I know we worry about being dignified, maybe we're afraid of being called radical or something, but to worship God, it requires that we turn loose. We get loose. He's worthy of it all. And so here he goes, not knowing the outcome, not knowing what people are going to say, what people are going to think. Here's what he knows. God is worthy. And there he goes up this mountain. Got that boy, got that wood. Isaac don't know what's about to happen next, but he finds the place and he finds the spot. And according to the Bible, he set up the altar, he laid the wood, and he had the fire, and he bound his son, ready to take his life, had a dagger in his hand, ready to slay his son. Why? God is worthy. But about that time, in verse number 11, the Bible says, And the angel of the Lord called unto him out of heaven, and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. And he said, Lay not thine hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him. For now I know that thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram, caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for a burnt offering in the stead of his son. God said this to Abraham, Now I know. And again, God's not surprised. We're surprised, but God's not surprised. Now I know that thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son from me. God wanted Abraham's heart. What I think about when I read this is an Old Testament way of saying what the Apostle Paul would write down in Romans chapter 12 and verse number 1. Present your bodies a living sacrifice unto God, holy and acceptable, which is your reasonable service tonight. Like we said, God didn't want Isaac, God wanted Abraham. He wanted the heart, the affection, the mind, the devotion of Abraham. And God knew where Abraham was at, but now Abraham truly knew where his heart was really at tonight. God desires a heart that's full of love and sincerity and devotion toward Him. And when Abraham saw that place as worship, and he saw that place where God was worthy. He is worthy of it all, not willing to hold anything back from God. God let him see something else. Not only did he let him see what he had done, I believe he got a glimpse of what he would do. Read a little further in verse 14, and Abraham called the name of that place Jehovah Jireh. As it is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord it shall be seen. I believe what Abraham saw that day when he worshiped God was not what only God would do on that day or what he had done, but he was getting a glimpse for himself, and he is getting a glimpse for us on what he would do on another mount. I believe it was there he saw he hadn't held anything back from God, and God wasn't going to hold anything back from him. Let me say that again tonight. Don't worry about if I give it all to God. Don't worry about it. God's give it all for us tonight. Spared not His only begotten Son, that He might come down here and save a bunch of sinners like me and you. Gave Him up to die in our place. We were Isaac. We were bound. We should have been dead. But I believe it was there where He said, Jehovah Jireh. It is this day in the mount of the Lord. It shall be seen. Not it has been seen. It shall be seen. The goodness and the glory and the might and the power of God. He got a glimpse of what would be. Here's one of the things I think about. He saw it as a place of worship, a place to devote and declare the worthiness of God. And for that, God let him get not only a glimpse of that place, but he left there with a great glimpse of God and His glory, and not only what He had done, but what He would do. I don't know about you tonight, but I desire to see His glory. I desire to see His glory. I desire to feel His presence. I desire to know Him and who He is. Not what my idea of Him is, but who He really is. In all His character, in all His holiness, in all His attributes and His righteousness tonight. And I believe when we worship God, we give it all to God, God will start pouring it on us right back. I know a lot of times we say, man, God gets in here, we'll worship Him. Start worshiping Him and God will get in here. Get in here. And I know, like I said earlier, worship is more than just Sunday and more than just in the church. But we're talking about being in the church. A lot of times, I've always kind of scratched my head about my own self and some of the things I've heard through my Christian life about. And I know, man, the Spirit of the Lord, He passes by in mighty ways. But you want to get God in this place and get another glimpse of that glory and get a little feel of His presence and His power. Start proclaiming how worthy He is. Don't worry about what your neighbors are thinking about it. Say it like this, man. He is worthy. He is deserving. I might be seen as radical. I might be seen as getting in the way. But I ain't holding anything back in spirit and in truth, in genuineness and inward man. I want to proclaim tonight He is worthy and deserving. God is well pleased with that. He went there to worship. Went there to give His Son, give the dearest thing He had. And God said, now I know thou fearest me. I know you're devoted to me. And you're devoted to me. Guess what? I'm devoted to you. And I love you and I care about you. Here's what I have done. Here's what I will do. And I tell you this tonight, talking about worship, living in worship. I can only imagine, we said there a minute ago, what was that trip like going up that mountain? What was that like for Abraham? Isaac had already asked the question, where's the sacrifice? And all Abraham could tell him was God would provide. God would provide. We're going yonder, boy. See that spot up there? We're going yonder to tell the world, to tell everybody, He is worthy, and to be obedient and serve Him. You ever thought about what that trip down that mountain was like? I believe it's a good trip for both of them, don't you? I believe old Isaac was just tickled to death. I can't, and I don't want to be careful. I don't want to put things in the Bible that ain't there, but This is my belief, and you can have your belief. But I can't help but to think somewhere in the heart of that little boy, he thought to himself, thank you, little lamb. Thank you, little ram. I was a dead, I was a goner, but you took my place. Yeah, I believe he was nervous and anxious going up. But boy, he's a feeling good coming back, wasn't he? Coming back down. And I don't believe, and I don't want to put anything in the Bible, but yeah, I thought about this as I was reading it today. Do you reckon Isaac ever forgot about that? I mean, he was old enough to know what was going on, so he was old enough to have a memory, and he was old enough to recollect what was happening. I can't help but to think he probably never forgot about that ram in that thicket, boy. And son, I'll tell you what a lesson for you and I. I don't ever want to forget about that lamb, do you? And I don't ever want to forget about that lamb that stood in our place and laid down his life in our place when we were goners and we were dead. He showed up on time, didn't he? Right on time, man. Stepped right in our stead. And no matter how old we get or far we get or mature we get in the faith, I don't ever want to forget about the place where the Lamb took my place. Yeah, I believe they had a better trip going back down. So they left with a greater glimpse of God, a greater glimpse of His glory. Abraham thought he was going to have to go home and tell his wife how he'd had to take the life of their child, their only son, that they had trusted God for. But instead he could come back down and say this, I told you, Sarah, he's worthy, he's dependable, he's faithful. He had a testimony when he come back. And where's the testimony come from? A test. He had something to say when he came back down. Let me say this tonight. If we give it all to God and empty out our heart for God, His devotion, to declare His worthiness, we'll have something to say. He'll make it worth our while. It may have been dreadful going up, but coming back down, I bet he is glad he endured and he made the trip and he went the extra mile for what he got to see and what he got to hear and what he got to experience, man. We get to worshiping God. We'll have something to say. We'll have some times and some experience. We'll have something to share tonight when God gives us that greater glimpse of His glory. He's worthy. He's worthy of it all, isn't He? And I'll tell you what, God don't disappoint tonight. He don't let anybody down. Talking about worship, you think about people like Job. Job had already lost everything. It wasn't a matter if he was going to give it up, but what did he do when everything had fell apart, went apart, messed up in his life? He went back to those ashes. And he said he's worthy. I'll tell you what, I don't know what life. So we've been used to worshiping God and trying to be faithful to God and loyal and obedient and devoted to God. We've been doing it with cars and trucks and houses and heat and air and plenty of food and plenty of gas and plenty of money for the most part, I guess. Now, hadn't we? But I think about some of the songs we sing sometimes and things. Thinking about, there are people that's worship God without a quarter of what we've got right now materially. And I ain't here to remind you of all the bad that's being predicted, but we all know there's some hard times being predicted. Only God knows. If we run out of gas, if we run out of food, if we run out of luxuries, God help us tonight. To still get together on Sunday. Lord willing that we can get together and meet and say, boy, he's worthy. Oh, it'll upset somebody because somebody will say, if he's so worthy and he's so good and he's God, why is all this happening to me? Oh, but why did all the good things happen to us? Why did He save a wretch like me? And regardless of what we're driving, how we're faring, how we're living, He's still worthy, still deserving of our devotion and our loyalty tonight. I want to give Him my heart, don't you? I want to give Him my life. He's worthy of it all. And what a testimony and what a witness it can be as we go through our life, not just Sunday, but as we go through day by day by day. just to live in obedience and dedication to Him and loyalty and allegiance to Him. What a testimony. People see, people know. It's evident where our heart's at tonight. You don't, and I'm not against stickers and t-shirts, but you don't have to have stickers and t-shirts. It's evident in how you worship. It's evident in how you live your life, where your heart's at tonight. And God truly wants our heart, a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable. Now, one of the parts in that verse that sticks out to me is this. That's our reasonable service. It's only reasonable tonight. We look at what God asked Abraham and think, boy, that's extravagant. But when we look and see what God's done for us, it's only reasonable that we'd be willing to give all back, ain't it? It's only reasonable, and I know I've shared this illustration several times here, but I'll share it again, and then we'll go to the house. There's a reasonable response for every gift. When somebody gives you a piece of candy, thank you's enough. That's reasonable, isn't it? Somebody give you a piece of candy to say thank you for the candy, that's reasonable. But if somebody gave you a check for $1 million, more than thank you, would you agree? Probably. Somebody handed you $1 million, I'd say more than a thank you would be acceptable. Maybe thank them, hug their neck, wash their car for the rest of their life, mow their yard. If they ever needed anything, needed something fixed, needed something done, ever needed a favor, I'd say they'd be worthy, wouldn't you? Their hot water heater went out, or their whatever, their deck needed work done. If they gave me $1 million, I'd say call me anytime, any hour, whatever, whenever, I'm there. You're worthy. You deserve it. Well, God gave us more than $1 million tonight. He definitely gave us more than a piece of candy. He gave us more than $1 million. I know He's blessed us with our homes, our jobs and things, but that's not our treasures tonight. That's just them little benefits, ain't it? Boy, our blessings is when God gave His only begotten Son. Not only that, He filled us with the earnest of the Spirit and gave us His holy word tonight and has written our names in the Lamb's Book of Life. I'd say any time, any hour, any place, whatever it is, He's worthy, wouldn't you? He deserves it tonight. He deserves our worship. Let's all stand to our feet. We'll go to the